After 19 years, the police came for him. Don Miller drove to Round Rock to arrest Hatley. Make no mistake, the day is 6/6 of 6, and we are about to meet the devil himself.
The bathtub murder that took 19 years to solve. Before you keep watching, I want you to do something for me. Type in the comments right now, where in the world you're watching this from, and what time it is for you at this exact moment. I read every single one. And trust me, by the end of this video, you're going to want to know you weren't the only one sitting there, wide awake, unable to look away from a screen at whatever hour it is for you right now. Because what I'm about to tell you happened in a town where everyone thought they were safe. Where everyone thought they knew each other. Where everyone was absolutely, 100% certain they knew exactly who committed a murder. They were wrong. For 19 years, they were wrong. And the man who actually did it sat in the same pews, walked the same streets, and lived his entire life a few miles away from the family he destroyed, while an innocent man carried the weight of a crime he never committed. This is the story of Susan Woods. And I promise you, you have never heard a cold case quite like this one. If you're new here, welcome to the Cold Case Archive, where we dig into real, thoroughly researched unsolved and cold cases from all over the world. If that sounds like your kind of story, go ahead and hit that subscribe button right now, tap the like button so this video reaches more people who need to hear this story, and let's get into it. Our story begins in Stephenville, Texas. A small town about 70 miles southwest of Fort Worth. The kind of place where church on Sunday wasn't optional, where neighbors actually knew each other's names, and where, for most of its history, violent crime was something that happened somewhere else. Somewhere far away. Not here. That illusion shattered in the summer of 1987. Susan Woods was 30 years old. She was quiet by nature. Shy, even. She wasn't the kind of person who needed to be the center of attention in a room, and she didn't surround herself with a huge circle of friends. But if you were lucky enough to be one of the few people she let close, you knew you had someone in your corner for life. Susan treated the people she loved like family, because to her, that's exactly what they were. She was raised in a devout household. Her father served as a deacon at their local church, and Susan and her brother spent much of their childhood there, surrounded by faith, by community, by the quiet rhythm of small-town life. After she graduated high school with honors, Susan took a job at a local factory. It wasn't glamorous work, but she was proud of it, and she was reliable. The kind of employee who didn't miss shifts. The kind of person her coworkers could set their watch by. A few years after graduating, Susan met a man who was, in almost every way, her opposite. His name was Michael Woods. Where Susan was quiet and steady, Michael was restless and loud. He dreamed of becoming a rock musician. He played guitar, he had a temper, and he had a habit of getting into conflicts that made a lot of people in town keep their distance from him. When Susan started seeing him, her friends and her parents all tried, gently at first and then not so gently, to talk her out of it. But Susan had fallen for him. And in 1980, the two of them got married. For the first few years, they tried living in different places, chasing whatever version of stability Michael thought he might find. At one point they moved several hours away to try city life, hoping a change of scenery might help Michael's music career, or at least help him hold down steady work. It didn't take long for Susan to realize that life wasn't for her. She missed her family, she missed Stephenville, and eventually the two of them moved back home. But moving home didn't fix what was actually broken. Over the years that followed, it was Susan who kept the household running. She worked at the factory, she picked up extra shifts when money was tight, and more often than not, it was her paycheck holding things together. Michael, meanwhile, spent much of his time playing guitar in the yard, drinking, and chasing a dream that never seemed to get any closer. Every so often he'd take a job, but he rarely lasted long before he was fired again. Then, just a few months before Susan's death, Michael was offered a job out of state, in Indianapolis, Indiana. It seemed, on paper, like exactly the kind of fresh start he'd always talked about. Susan said no. She didn't want to leave Stephenville. She didn't want to leave her family. She had given this marriage nearly 7 years of her life, and she was done chasing someone else's dream at the expense of her own. So Michael left. Without her. And he didn't leave quietly. He took Susan's car with him when he went. He took her jacket. He even took the small porcelain figurines the two of them had spent years collecting together, pieces that had meant something to Susan, pieces that represented whatever good memories still existed in that marriage. And before he walked out the door for the final time, Michael did something that would haunt Susan for the rest of her short life. He recorded a lengthy cassette tape, addressed directly to her, and left it behind for her to find. On it, he blamed her for the marriage falling apart. He criticized her, insulted her, and laid out, in his own voice, every grievance he apparently felt entitled to air on his way out the door. That wasn't the end of it either. In the weeks that followed, Susan began finding handwritten notes hidden around the house. Tucked into drawers. Left where she'd be sure to find them. Each one was filled with insults and accusations, small cruelties designed, it seemed, purely to hurt her. Susan was frightened. She told her closest friends that she was afraid of Michael, afraid that one day he might come back to Stephenville, walk into her house uninvited, and hurt her. That fear was serious enough that she asked someone close to her to nail every single window in her house shut, so that nothing could be opened from the outside. She was offered a gun for protection and turned it down. She had only recently filed for divorce. At the time of her death, she and Michael were still, technically, legally married. Now, if you're the kind of person who already has a theory forming in your head about who did this, hold on to it. Because I promise you, this case is going to prove that certainty and truth are not always the same thing. On the 28th of July, 1987, Susan's father received a phone call from her supervisor at the factory. Susan hadn't shown up for work in 2 days. Nobody could reach her. Her boss had tried calling repeatedly with no answer. Susan's father knew immediately that something was wrong. His daughter simply wasn't the kind of person who missed work without telling anyone. He got in his car and drove straight to her house. When he arrived, he could hear the television playing somewhere inside. He knocked. No answer. He tried the door, and found it unlocked. He stepped inside, calling out for his daughter, and the only sound that answered him was the television, still running in the living room. He walked toward the bedroom first. And immediately, he could see that something had gone terribly wrong. The bed had been shoved out of place. The mattress hung half off its frame. Torn bedding lay scattered across the floor, tangled up with articles of clothing. Panic was setting in. He turned to leave the bedroom, and that's when something else caught his eye. The bathroom door was open, just slightly. He walked toward it. He looked inside. And there was his daughter. Susan's body was draped over the edge of the bathtub. She had no clothing on. Her hands had been tied behind her back with a torn piece of clothing. The water in the tub had turned almost completely black, saturated with blood. Even in that moment of unbearable shock, some part of Susan's father understood immediately that his daughter was gone, and that there was nothing left for him to do to save her. He ran from the house and called the police. In a town as small and as quiet as Stephenville, murder simply didn't happen. So when the call came in, nearly every available officer was sent to the scene. What they found inside would haunt the investigators for years. The bathtub had been filled almost to the top. The water, once clear, had turned nearly black from the amount of blood in it. Detectives believed the killer had held Susan under that water until she died. But that wasn't the only method of attack. There was a distinct mark around Susan's neck, consistent with strangulation by some type of cord or rope. Investigators found a cord lying on her bed. They also noticed clear makeup stains pressed into her pillow, evidence that her face had been forced against it with tremendous pressure. Piece by piece, a horrifying picture began to form. It looked as though the killer had first attempted to smother and possibly strangle Susan on the bed, using a pillow and a cord, before dragging her into the bathroom and holding her underwater until she died. Because her clothing had been removed, investigators also believed she had been sexually assaulted. The level of brutality made it almost impossible for detectives to believe this had been some kind of random break-in gone wrong. This felt personal. This felt like rage. Susan's body was sent to the medical examiner, and detectives kept working the scene. In the living room, they found something that, on its own, seemed almost mundane, but in context was deeply unsettling. An ashtray, packed with cigarette butts. A half-eaten bag of snacks. A can of Coke sitting on a small table near the couch. Susan's father told investigators that his daughter didn't smoke, and she almost never drank Coke. Which meant, in all likelihood, these items had been left behind by whoever killed her. Judging by the sheer number of cigarettes in that ashtray, the killer may have spent hours inside that house before the attack even began. That detail changed everything about how detectives viewed the case. This didn't look like a stranger breaking in. It looked like someone Susan knew. Someone she had let inside willingly. Someone she may have offered snacks and a drink to, someone she allowed to sit and smoke in her own living room, before something turned catastrophically violent. And here's where the case gets even stranger. As investigators searched the house further, they discovered that every single window frame had been nailed shut. Deliberately. As though Susan had genuinely feared someone breaking in from the outside. And yet, crime scene technicians also found fresh marks on the front door, marks that could have indicated an attempted forced entry. So which was it? Had someone tried to force their way in, only to fail and be let in willingly through some other means? Or had the killer already been inside, comfortable, relaxed, smoking cigarettes and eating snacks, before turning on Susan entirely? Investigators weren't sure. But they had one piece of physical evidence that felt, at the time, like it might crack the entire case wide open. On the faucet in the bathroom, technicians discovered a clear palm print, along with several fingerprints. Based on their position, it appeared the killer had braced his hand against that faucet while holding Susan's head underwater. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment right now with the words, "I'm still here." I want to see who's actually following along with this story until the very end, because trust me, what happens next is going to completely change the way you look at everyone involved. Here's the problem investigators ran into in 1987. There was no national fingerprint database the way there is today. No instant match, no algorithm, no automatic alert. If detectives wanted to compare that palm print and those fingerprints to a suspect, they had to do it by hand, one comparison at a time, against people they already had reason to suspect. DNA testing was even further out of reach. Detectives understood that the cigarette butts left behind in the living room likely contained the killer's saliva, and therefore his DNA. But the forensic technology to actually extract and use that evidence in a meaningful way simply didn't exist yet, not in the way it does today. For the time being, those fingerprints were the strongest lead they had, and they had nowhere to run them. Detectives spoke with Susan's neighbors, and one gave them a small but intriguing lead. Someone had noticed a very large man near Susan's house around the time of the murder. They couldn't recall many other details, but investigators held on to that description. When the medical examiner completed the autopsy, the findings confirmed that Susan had been sexually assaulted. But because of the extent of the injuries, experts could not determine which specific act had actually caused her death. They could see clear signs of strangulation by cord. They could see signs of smothering by pillow. And they could see that she had been held underwater. All three had happened. They simply couldn't say which one, in the end, had taken her life. Investigators also spoke extensively with Susan's family and friends. It quickly became clear that nobody had heard from her in the days leading up to the discovery of her body. And when detectives asked who they believed might be responsible, the answer was almost unanimous. Everybody, without exception, pointed to Michael. Given everything investigators had already learned, about the failed marriage, the cassette tape, the cruel notes, the nailed-shut windows, the fears Susan had expressed to her friends, it made sense. Michael became the prime suspect almost immediately. There was just one significant problem. At the time of the murder, Michael Woods was living in Indianapolis, roughly a 15-hour drive away. Investigators needed to know whether he had made his way back to Texas around the time Susan was killed. Detectives reached out to police in Indiana, who located and questioned Michael directly. He denied any involvement. He claimed to have an alibi for the night of the murder. That information was passed back to detectives in Texas, and for a while, it seemed to weaken the case against him. But here's the thing about small towns. Facts don't always travel as far, or as fast, as suspicion does. Word spread through Stephenville, and it never really stopped spreading. For nearly 2 decades, if you asked almost anyone in that town who killed Susan Woods, they would tell you, without hesitation, that it was her husband. Michael lived under that cloud of suspicion for 19 years. Followed by whispers wherever he went. Watched, questioned, doubted, in a town that had effectively convicted him in the court of public opinion, long before any court of law ever had the chance to weigh in. Meanwhile, the case itself went cold. Officially unsolved. The kind of file that gets pushed further and further back in a drawer as the years pass and no new leads come in. But one detective never fully let it go. Lieutenant Don Miller of the Stephenville Police Department kept returning to Susan's case over the years, even as it grew colder and colder. And slowly, the world around him began to change in ways that mattered enormously for cases exactly like this one. DNA testing improved dramatically. National fingerprint databases were built and expanded, linking law enforcement agencies across the entire country in ways that simply hadn't existed back in 1987. Around 2005, nearly 2 decades after Susan's murder, something unexpected happened. Michael Woods, the man who had spent almost 20 years living under the weight of a town's suspicion, confided in a friend named Barbara Gary about the toll it had all taken on him. That conversation ended up reigniting attention on the case in a meaningful way. Investigators reached out to Michael once more. And this time, technology had finally caught up to the case. Michael voluntarily agreed to provide a DNA sample. It did not match anything recovered from the crime scene. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, Michael Woods was formally, definitively cleared. Which meant, after 19 years, the real killer had been out there this entire time. Walking free. Living his life. While an innocent man carried the burden of suspicion in his place. Lieutenant Miller sent the old cigarette butts, still preserved from the scene all those years earlier, to a crime lab for testing. Male DNA was successfully recovered. But when it was run through the system, there was no match. Whoever this man was, he had never been arrested for anything serious enough to have his DNA already on file. Then, in 2006, Miller tried one more thing. He submitted the decades-old palm print and fingerprints, lifted from that bathroom faucet all those years before, into a national fingerprint database. A database that hadn't existed at all in 1987. This time, there was a hit. The name that came back was Joseph Scott Hatley. He wasn't a stranger passing through town. He reportedly knew Susan Woods through a relative. Which finally explained one of the most puzzling details of the entire case, why Susan may have let her killer walk right through her front door, why she may have sat with him, offered him something to eat and drink, allowed him to smoke cigarettes in her living room, all before something turned violently, fatally wrong. For 19 years, Joseph Scott Hatley had lived his life freely. He had gone to work. He had walked the same streets as Susan's grieving family. He may have crossed paths with people who loved her, who mourned her, who spent nearly 2 decades believing the wrong man was responsible. And through all of it, he said nothing. In 2007, Joseph Scott Hatley entered into a plea deal. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison for the murder of Susan Woods. He did not serve anywhere close to that sentence. Hatley was released early, in 2018, after serving only about 11 years behind bars. A few years later, in 2021, after being diagnosed with bladder cancer, Joseph Scott Hatley was found dead inside his trailer home. His landlord discovered his body. He was 56 years old. After his death, investigators were given access to personal writings Hatley had left behind. Dark, unsettling reflections that offered, for the first time, a small window into the mind of the man responsible. But even those writings never fully answered the one question that had haunted Stephenville for 19 years. Why? Susan Woods never lived to see her killer identified, arrested, or sentenced. Her father never got to see the true face of the man who took his daughter from him. And for most of his remaining years, he, like the rest of the town, believed the responsible party was someone else entirely. It is one of the most sobering reminders you'll find in any cold case. How completely, how confidently, an entire community can point in exactly the wrong direction, for nearly 2 decades, while the real answer sits quietly, patiently, waiting for the right piece of technology, and the right detective who refuses to give up, to finally catch up to the truth. If this case affected you the way it affected me while researching it, that's exactly why this channel exists. Before you go, do 3 things for me. Like this video, so it reaches more people who need to hear this story told accurately. Drop a comment down below and let me know which part of this case shocked you the most. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the Cold Case Archive, because every single week, we bring you jaw-dropped cases, so stay tuned. See you on the next one.